I want to begin. How you doing, Brett? Always appreciate that guy. I want to begin by asking a question. And the question is, when you wake up in the morning and you look in the mirror and you reflect on who you are, what do you see? When you look in the mirror, is it a positive thing? Is it an encouraging thing? But how do you view yourself? You know, I once talked with a young woman once, and she was pretty broken up. Low self-esteem, just a lot of bad things gone in her life. And I asked her the question, I said, what does it look like when you look in the mirror? Just trying to get an idea of where she was emotionally. And she said, Micah, if you would take a mirror, throw it on the ground, have the mirror cracked, then hang it back up on the wall, and then you look at it, that's really how I see myself. And the idea was, you know, the mirror should give you a good image of yourself, but when she looked in her life, when she looked in her mirror, it seemed cracked, broken. And a lot of it started with the fact that so many people in her life told her how she was not able to do anything. She was dumb. You're not good enough. You'll never meet my expectations. I mean, have you ever had those situations where you looked in your mirror and then for a moment it seems like it's cracked because of maybe experiences in your life or what people had said in your life? And you look in that mirror and sometimes you say, well, I don't think I can really accomplish much. I can't accomplish much in my life. I can't really change my life. Or maybe I can't even serve God in the way that I read the Bible and my heart says I want to serve this way, but I just can't do it. I'm me. Maybe if I was one of our elders, maybe if I was, Brett, maybe if I was Mark, maybe if I was someone like that, maybe I could do it, but I'm just me. And oftentimes that's something that thwarts our service. Because we don't have a high value on ourselves in the way that God has value for us. Maybe in your life you've had people tell you you're not good enough. Maybe they've told you you can't accomplish much. Maybe you're even afraid to serve within the church in different ministries, even though you've been asked, or even if you have the right heart, but because you think so lowly of yourself, maybe you think, I can't do it. Have you ever been that way? You know, one of the things that I know growing up, I've always grown up with low self-esteem, kind of been the underdog and kind of told certain things. But one of the things that really encouraged me is the idea that underdogs exist. And one of the things that I love to do is I love history, I love reading about things, and I love reading biographies. But I came across a woman who's an unsung hero of the Civil War. And if you would have told her in her young life that she was going to change the world, be surrounded by influential people, you would have thought, that's not going to ever happen. And I read this lady's story, and I heard someone speak about her at one point, and I was just amazed, and I said, okay, at this point, after hearing her story, I have no excuse. Especially when I have the backing of God. And that's this woman by the name of Elizabeth Keckley. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of her. But almost everything bad that you can imagine in life happened to her. She was born a slave. From a slave and her master. She was a byproduct. And she was pushed into hard service at the age of 4 years old. And to make things even more complicated, at the age of 6 years old, she was required to be the parent to her master's kids. She was in charge. They said, okay, you're the new governess of our kids. At 6 years old. And anytime she made a parenting mistake in the view of the master, she was beaten. I mean, life was not easy for her. And as she grew up, she was still a very good servant. And in fact, she finally convinced her master to give her freedom if he would sell it to her. And he jokingly said, okay, yeah, if you give me $1,200, I will let you and your son go free. Do you know what the amazing thing is? That woman borrowed and raised $1,200 and bought her own freedom. And what was even more amazing was, with all the different things, with the Underground Railroad and all the different things that are going on, people came up to her and said, we can get you out of here, and we can get you out of here for free. And she said, no, I'm going to pay what I owe, what I borrowed. And she stayed for years working off that $1,200. She didn't want to look over her shoulder. She didn't want to be indebted to anybody. And so after she bought her freedom, she moved to Washington, D.C. And she knew how to make dresses. And so she designed a dress, and the wife of the famous general, Robert E. Lee, bought it. And when she bought this dress, she was amazed, and she wore it in town, and everyone in high society in Washington, D.C. said, where did you get that dress? Tell me, I want to buy a dress. And that's how Elizabeth Keckley got so famous. And in fact, she became the dressmaker for Mary Todd Lincoln, the wife of Abraham Lincoln. And in fact, she became best friends with the wife of the president. Now, as I mentioned, she didn't have an easy life. She lost her son. The son that she paid his slavery freedom for, she lost him. But instead of sulking about it, she used that experience to comfort Mary Todd Lincoln, because she too lost a son. And so Elizabeth, with the pain of her loss, used that as an experience to encourage the wife of our president. We know that after victory by the North, Abraham Lincoln was shot. And when he was shot, friends, family, advisors went up to Mary Todd Lincoln, and they tried to encourage her. And she was sad, and she was depressed. And in fact, she was a very emotional person by a creature in reality. She hated the criticism of her husband. She hated it and couldn't handle it very well. She was emotional, and Elizabeth Keckley was the one who kind of calmed her down. But when she heard her husband was shot, she was not willing to calm down. But then when she finally calmed down, she said a few words, and she said, "Get me Elizabeth Keckley." She didn't want anyone else. She wanted Elizabeth Keckley. And Elizabeth came to her and comforted her at the loss of her husband. If he would have said, you know what, this girl who was born into slavery, had a hard life, lost her child, would become the confidant and the best friend and the source of comfort to the wife of the president, none of us would have believed it. You read a story like that, and you hear her story, and you think, she's amazing. But even beyond that, after this, her story didn't end. After that, she started a foundation and a charity to help black soldiers who were wounded in the Civil War. And even at that point, she wasn't even thinking about herself. She didn't sit in the corner and say, woe is me, my life is horrible, I'm incapable of doing anything, I'm a slave. She rose up and she did what she believed she was called to do. You know, as Christians, we know that we're called to be world changers. We know that we are called to change the world because Jesus changed the world as a servant. You would say, you're telling me a poor son of a carpenter can change the world through service? The answer is yes. And you're telling me that the followers of this Jewish carpenter from Nazareth can make a difference by service? The answer is yes. And that's what we have been called to do. In fact, you have been chosen to serve. You know, one of the things that people often struggle with is they say, well, I can't serve. I'm not that gifted. I'm not that smart. I'm not that talented. And the fact is, that doesn't matter when God has specifically and individually had chosen you to serve. You know, it's not like dodgeball where you're chosen last. God, before the creation of this world, said, I want you. And in fact, we're going to be covering a story of a man who was chosen. A man who had a very difficult ministry. And in fact, if he would have interviewed here as your minister, you probably would not have hired him. But this man made a difference. And why? Was it because he was the most talented? The most charismatic? Or was it because God specifically chose him to serve, just like how he has chosen each and every one of you to serve? You look at a story like this guy that we're going to cover, you think about Elizabeth Keckley, and we say, you know what, it's not really about how talented I am. It's whether or not I have the heart of service like the God who chose me to serve. And am I willing to rise up and say, I will accept? So let's look at how we are chosen to serve. And one of the great stories of a person being chosen is the story of Jeremiah. Jeremiah was a prophet of God during a time when God's people were under captivity. And he had a hard ministry. But God is going to come to Jeremiah and tell him, you're going to be my prophet, and you're going to speak to my people, and this is what I'm going to tell you to say. But just like Moses, Jeremiah is going to throw up some objections. But eventually he serves. And as you know from that big book in the Old Testament, Jeremiah made a huge difference. Let's read Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 4 through 10. It says, Now the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. Then I said, Ah, Lord God, behold, I do not know how to speak, for I am only a youth. But the Lord said to me, Do not say, I am only a youth. For to all whom I send, you shall go, and whatever I command you, you shall speak. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you to deliver you, declares the Lord. Then the Lord put out his hand and touched my mouth. And the Lord said to me, Behold, I have put my words in your mouth. See, I have set you this day over the nations and over kingdoms to pluck up and to break down, to destroy and to overthrow, to build and to plant. You see, one of the great things about this story is that we see that in choosing Jeremiah, God made known the idea that Jeremiah was chosen to fulfill God's purpose. And in fact, just like us, we have been chosen. You know, you read Ephesians 1, we see that we are chosen. Even before the creation of the world, we were chosen to be with God. We know from Ephesians chapter 2, we are created to do good works, which God set beforehand for us to do. And just like what he told Jeremiah, and I know God is a God who plans. If you were here on Wednesday, Walt made a good comment in class about how God is a God who plans and how he'll make a decision and then thousands of years later it will come about. And I think that's what God did here. Do you see what he said to Jeremiah? He said, you know what? Before you were created in your mother's womb, I knew you. Imagine that. The creator of the universe says, before you were even born, before even your mom and dad were born, I knew you. And I knew what I had purpose for you to do within my will. Can you imagine that God has called you to fulfill his purpose? Do you know, I always try to think how God brings about things in order for each of us to specifically make a difference. You know, sometimes we read the Bible and we generalize and say, yeah, we know Christians or the church should make a difference and serve. And God made things happen so that's possible. But have we also thought about how God specifically and individually called you to serve? You know, I think about how God called Zacchaeus to serve, but do you know how we know God called Zacchaeus to serve? He first made that tree grow that he would climb up. You know, we think about how God allows all these different things. Why are you here today? Who did God put in your life? What experiences, both good and bad, did God allow you to experience so that you can actually serve within the Father's will? Because not every experience was easy. Look at Elizabeth Keckley. She had a life of struggle and hardship, but it allowed her to serve. Look at Joseph, sold into slavery, falsely accused of rape, imprisoned, and he went through all those experiences, and God allowed him to do so that he would become the most powerful man in the world and save his people, to preserve the remnant. God does amazing things. So you may ask, can I serve? Yes, because God knew you. And not only did he know you, he chose you. Can you imagine, out of all the people in the world he could have chosen, he chose you. What does that say about how valuable God feels about you? So that's what he did with Jeremiah. But God also helps us in our choosing, helps us overcome our inadequacies. Do you see what people of God often do when they're asked to serve? Have you ever asked to serve and you tried to come up with the first excuse? I'm washing my hair that day. You just come up with something. And so Jeremiah kind of did what Moses did. And if he knew his Old Testament history, he knew God's not going to accept that. Jeremiah said, but I don't know how to speak. Well, neither did Moses, according to Moses, but God's going to let you speak. And he said, but I'm only a youth. Most scholars said he was about 17. Well, most scholars also say that David was about 17. So if Jeremiah knew anything about the God of the Old Testament, he would say, yeah, all these excuses you're coming up with, these inadequacies, these things are not going to be good enough. If the will of God was solely dependent on us, God would choose the most talented, the smartest, and the most charismatic. But God chooses all of us. And no matter how we view ourselves, God, who knows us, how he made us, with the temperament, the skills, the spiritual giftedness he would give us when we become Christians, he knows. And he makes it so that we would overcome our inadequacies. Someone once said that the Bible is just a story of ordinary people serving an extraordinary God, and that's why the story is extraordinary. And that's one of the things that we have to remember. We may have all these inadequacies, but guess what? Maybe God will rise you up and do things. A lot of people say, well, I've never done that before. I don't know how to do that. But this is where God will empower you to serve. When you first start some kind of service or within a ministry, you've never done that before. The people who have done that before have never done it before when they first started. But you want to know how you grow? You grow when you're challenged. You grow when you do things you've never done before. And you grow when you realize the power doesn't come from me, the power comes from God. Because God made known very specifically to Jeremiah, saying, you know what, despite your inability to speak, despite your youth, despite the message I'm going to have you share, I'm going to cause you to rise up and you're going to be great. And Jeremiah was great. He was a fantastic prophet of God. A hard ministry, not a ministry that people would flock to run to, but he was a powerful one. So even if you look in your mirror and if you think, you know what, I'm not that significant, all you got to remember is look in the Word of God and say, God has a track record of taking people who don't think much of themselves to making them amazing people of faith. Think about this. Did Abraham ever sacrifice a son before he was first called to sacrifice? Did Joseph ever lead a nation before God called him to serve a nation? Was Daniel ever in a lion's den before he was in the lion's den? I'm going to challenge you this year to serve and be part of some of the ministries that we have within the church that are doing great things. And you might say, I've never done that before. I may not be gifted. I may not be talented. And I say, that doesn't matter when we have the God that we have. God will empower you to serve. But one of the things that we also have to realize is, how are we going to serve? If you have been chosen, do you know how special it is when you're chosen by someone for a special task? Have you ever had a sport where you were specifically singled out for it? Or at a job and you were specifically singled out? And how good it made you feel? But one of the things that I've emphasized, and I mentioned this last week, is service is not always fun. When you're serving God, it's not always going to be easy. It's not all sunshine and rainbows. We don't serve only when it's fun. We serve God always. Even in the times when it's difficult. And even when in the times of difficulty, that's sometimes when service is most important. So someone asks, well, how do I keep serving? You know, I know a lot of you have served, especially you ladies who have taught children for years. You know, my wife has always taught children's classes ever since I was a minister, and even prior to that. It's exhausting. But what causes people to continue on serving? Despite the exhaustion, despite the criticism, despite the sacrifice, the answer is passion. When you are chosen to serve and you realize that you are being called by God and He's depending on you to do something, and then you realize it's the purpose for which God has given you for your life, and you become passionate about it, that's when you do great things. Passion doesn't happen when you just love service. Passion happens when you realize the significance of what you're doing and you do it beyond all the hardships. Think about Jesus. He didn't think it was fun being on a cross. Jesus didn't think it was fun being criticized or beaten or falsely accused, but He was passionate. That's why that last week is the passion in the Christ, because He saw what was important and He kept it up. And that's what Jeremiah did as well. Jeremiah actually had a message of doom and gloom. That's why I said you guys probably wouldn't hire him, because everything was hellfire and brimstone. Everything's going to fall and die. That guy's going to imprison you. Your kids are going to be in prison. You're going to die. You're going to die. You're going to have judgment. The wrath of God's going to come upon you. Sound very like a good message? But that's what Jeremiah was doing, because he was trying to cause the people of God to repent and turn back to God. He had to preach a hard message because their hearts were even harder. And so one of the things that got Jeremiah through this and continued on serving despite the criticism, despite the sacrifice, despite the beatings, despite the exhaustion, was passion. Look at his passion. In Jeremiah chapter 20, verse 7 through 11, it says, O Lord, you have deceived me, and I was deceived. You are stronger than I, and you have prevailed. I've become a laughingstock all the day, and everyone mocks me. For whenever I speak, I cry out and I shout. Violence and destruction, for the word of the Lord has become for me a reproach and a derision all day long. If I say I will not mention him or speak any more in his name, there is in my heart, as it were, a burning fire shut up in my bones, and I am weary with holding it in, and I cannot. For I hear many whispering, terrors on every side. Denounce him. Let us denounce him. Say all my close friends, watching for my fall. Perhaps he will be deceived. Then we can overcome him and take our revenge on him. But the Lord is with me as a dread warrior. Therefore my persecutors will stumble, and they will not overcome me. They will be greatly shamed, for they will not succeed. Their eternal dishonor will never be forgotten. See, Jeremiah acknowledged that he had a hard mission. But he made known, you know what, even my friends and my family are trying to get me. But you know what, I have this message, I have this desire, I have this burning passion that's burning in my bones, and I can't keep it in. When God tells me to speak, I have no other choice to speak, because no matter how big the obstacle, I am going to be passionate. You know, I've been really inspired by passionate. I love passionate people for Christ, because even when times are hard, that's when passion's needed the most. They say you need to outlast a hardship. I'm going to give you a few that are really have been encouraging. And by one of the stories, a testament to this church. You know, this church has had 2 youth interns that has really encouraged, who the church really encouraged. One was David, and another was Adam Brock. And do you know what's amazing about these 2 young men? They both committed their lives to serving God. And I can tell you, their lives are not the easiest lives. You know, David, I'm impressed by him. I had a meal with them while he was visiting. He's going to school, getting a master's degree. He's working a job. He just got married, and he's now doing a foster care type care of a child because of a young boy in his wife's family needing a home. And all of this while also serving the church. And there are times where he's probably exhausted, he's discouraged, struggling, but he still does it. And I'm inspired by him. And it kind of makes me want to work even harder. And he does it because he has passion. And I think about Adam Brock, how we're now supporting him, and because he decided, I'm going to give up my secular job, and I'm going to now go into youth ministry because I want to commit my life to God. And on top of that, I'm going to adopt a couple of kids. And then on top of that, I'm going to now foster care 2 more kids. Tom told me that the other day, and I'm thinking, wow, most people would say, well, I can't believe they're doing it. And I say, I can. When you have a person of faith with passion, they do things they never thought they were ever going to do, and they change the world. Another couple I just want to emphasize real quick was Trent. Last year he went on a mission trip to D.C. He devoted his time. You know, a lot of college students, you know, they squander their time. They go to Cancun. They do all the things that they say college students should do. He went and served. This last couple of weeks, I got a letter in the mail from Charles saying she's going on a mission trip to Boston. She's not doing what all the other kids are doing during that time. She says, I want to go help with the church, and they're going to be working with the homeless. They're going to do all these different things. And I was impressed. And she sent me a support letter, and I gave her some money for that, and she didn't ask me to do this, but I encourage you, you know what, encourage that passion. If you want to financially help her with that, to send her on that mission trip, I encourage you to do so. Because I think we want to inspire and reward passion. Jeremiah did it, and they're changing us. And our young people are passionate, and it's convicting us. You know, God used the youth in Jeremiah, and look at what God is doing among our youth now. And why? Because they have a passion and a fire in their bones that says, it cannot be held in any longer. I have to share the message of God. And one last thing that I just want to emphasize real quickly is you're preaching a message of hope. You know, most of what Jeremiah actually has to say, like I mentioned earlier, is really not a fun one. I would have hated to have Jeremiah's ministry. You talk about converts? No. You guys are all going to die. Everything's coming to a gloom. Your kids are going to get imprisoned. Now, a lot of us hearing that would be like, yeah, fire that guy. Throw him in a pit. I'll do it too. But despite all of that, God wasn't making the end destruction, even though that's what the people deserved. The end result and goal was hope. And so one of the passages we're going to read here in a moment is often one that's often misused out of context a little bit. But God is going to be talking through Jeremiah to the people, making known, you know, I had a plan to prosper you and not harm you, plan to give you a hope in the future. I have this plan where Jeremiah's teaching all this doom and gloom, but the reality is, yes, you have to go through that doom and gloom to soften up your heart so that once again you can have hope. And that's one of the things that we have to do. In our modern day culture, it's not very easy to teach the message of Jesus or share Jesus. Teaching repentance, not a fun thing to do in our culture. Teaching about sin and hell, not an easy, fun thing to do. And we don't do that and make that the end. We teach some of those hard doctrines because we say, because hope. Hope. Because God's plan was salvation. And that was what Jeremiah's message was to the people of Judah. Was, yes, doom and gloom, things are going to be horrible, but God will then rise you up in hope. Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 10 through 14, it says, For thus says the Lord, when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will visit you, and I will fulfill to you my promise, and bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. Then you will call upon me and come and pray to me, and I will hear you. You will seek me and find me, and when you seek me with all your heart, I will be found by you, declares the Lord. I will restore your fortunes and gather you from all the nations and all the places where I have driven you, declares the Lord. And I will bring you back to the place from which I sent you into exile. So even though Jeremiah had this hard message, he had a message of hope. And as Christians, we have a hard message too at times. But our message is also good news. It's the gospel. It's the good news. And it's the message of hope. And if people will give their hearts, then people will be saved. And the amazing thing is when the people of God first give their hearts to God, it allows God to use them to touch the hearts of other people so that they can come into relationship with God as well. That's why our lives, our service, and our message is one of hope. At the beginning of the sermon, I mentioned how this young girl saw herself as a cracked mirror, broken, worthless, useless. But that's not how God sees you. God sees you as the one He chose for a specific purpose. You're here and now at this time among us for a purpose. And you may feel inadequate, you may be afraid, you may not want to join a ministry or serve in a capacity because you may have never done it before, but let me tell you, that is sometimes when the greatest leaps of faith you'll ever make happen. Just like Abraham or Joseph or Moses. When you do what you are called to do, even though you have never done it before, because of the power of God and the plan of God and the will of God, then great things happen. So I want each and every one of you to know you are chosen by God. And He has empowered you. And He has empowered you to spread hope. So as God's people, let's do that. Commit this year to being a servant because God chose you. Stand up and say, I choose to accept that as well. At this time, as we're about to sing our song of invitation and encouragement, if you need us to pray for you and encourage you, if you want to give your life to Christ and say, I want to be chosen by God and be baptized and forgiven.